All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. I'm excited this week. As those of you who follow my stuff, you know I say I'm excited every single week because I legitimately get excited for these conversations. So it's not me just blowing smoke. I really do get excited about this. But this week in particular is going to be a fun one because in the age of the digital world, we're going to be talking about digital storytelling and the power of that, which is especially relevant in what I've kind of tagged, and I don't even know if I came up with it or I stole it, but in the age of distrust, where especially right now, people are going, what do I even believe? And there's all this stuff going on from a technology standpoint. And so we're going to unpack that, and we're going to talk about what that looks like, what we can do to do it effectively, and hopefully make it easier for everyone out there. So to navigate that conversation with me, I'm joined by Zenobia Godschalk, who is the head of communications at World's Lab, overseeing the Hedera ecosystem. Did I get it all right? The Hedera
You
ecosystem?
got it.
Did I get it all right?
Got it.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me
well,
on.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this. And we got introduced through, I can't remember, somebody had reached out and said that I should have you on here. And I really have been looking forward to when we have this conversation. But for those who may not be as familiar with you, little bit of backstory into you, and you have this brand around you, around this kind of tech storytelling, which is a pretty cool mix that I think sometimes gets lost because people are like, well, tech is the technology. And you're like, right, but it's the story underneath that. So how did that come to fruition?
Sure. So, yeah, I think one of my favorite movies is Field of Dreams, right? And in that
Okay.
movie, he gets this message: if you build it, they will come. And I think that a lot of people in tech think I have built the most amazing, most wonderful thing, and so everybody should come.
Yeah, I get emails from them like multiple times a day. They've invented the thing that nobody else has ever thought of.
Yes. And so, we use technology because it helps us live our lives better, right? In some ways it has hurt us, but for the most part, we use it, we adopt it, we embrace it because it has helped make our lives better. And so, my background is not a technologist. I am not in the bits and bytes of how the software works, but I am very interested and have always been interested in why. Why should I do this? Why should I use it? Why is it going to make my life better?
Now that why piece, was that part of your personality in general, or specific like to the tech thing? Like, were you just always that person growing up? You just why? Like, were you always like that? Or was it specifically as this technology was evolving, you're like, this one I'm exceptionally curious about?
So I was definitely always a little bit like that. And, as I think grandparents really like to point out, I now get to experience that with my children who.
Yeah, it comes full cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Why? Just because, right? And that's never a good enough answer for them.
No.
And, it was never a good enough answer for me. I mean, I loved to read. I loved stories. I loved to kind of understand the background and kind of the, all the things, the hero's journey.
Yeah, the characters, the plot, the everything.
Absolutely. All of that. And so I actually, when I was growing up, I thought I wanted to be many things, but going into college, I thought I might want to be a broadcast journalist. I might want to go and tell those stories from sort of all over the world and, kind of explore them, go deep, be able to share those.
I mean, if you loved asking why, I can see where journalism would be a fantastic field to pursue. It's a good place to go, asking lots of questions about what's going on here.
Absolutely. And I got to Stanford and I took my first communications class, and the professor, the TA pulled me aside and said, look, if you really want to do broadcast journalism, you probably need to go somewhere else. Like there are some great programs, but they are few and far between. And this is not one of the things we're known for. So
you're at Stanford in one of their programs and they're like, look, if this is really what you want, this probably is not, that's not, I mean, kudos to them for that advice, but that's not typically, you don't usually get people who would do that would kind of pull that card.
Yeah. So they were, there are some great programs, but it was essentially like, go to New York, go, do those kinds of things there, study there, et cetera. And at that point, I had already, fallen hook, line, and sinker for Stanford. I loved it. I, figured out, okay, well, I'll do something else, and kind of along the way, we'll figure it out. So I ended up doing my degree in economics and industrial engineering, which is completely different from communications. But again, I was lucky. I had some amazing professors. My econ professors had taught at the World Bank, or, worked at the World Bank. They had advised presidents, and it really opened up my eyes to, hey, like this, this is how the world works, right? These are the kinds of things that actually change how the world works. And I was lucky enough to be, in the right place at the right time. I graduated right before the dot-com boom. And so I went to work at Intel, and I was working in the finance department because that's where my degree was, and that's where they had a really big program. But I ended up supporting their PR function. So each finance group is assigned to Intel. Is a massive multi-billion-dollar business. So their PR function is
who is that again?
I've heard of them.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. It's ringing a bell.
So their PR function is a massive multi-million-dollar business, and they need somebody to oversee that P&L from the finance side. And so I was very lucky. I got to sit in at the highest levels of their corporate comms teams meetings and understand the kinds of initiatives they were working on, and really understand what a true communication strategy at a global scale meant. And I was like, ooh, this is really interesting. And I then had the opportunity. I was recruited out to a few startups. Intel, they had do many things right, but when you're starting your career there, and I think you're young and you're hungry, it's tough because it's very regimented, right? You do this for 18 months.
Big companies, that's one of the downsides. It's just, this is how it is. It's a machine. It works in a certain way. And that way doesn't always work for everybody. So I can see that being hard, especially early career.
Yeah. And so I was given the opportunity to join a startup. It was called Beyond.com, which was one of the first people to do something called digitally downloadable software, right? You no longer had to have a box shipped to your house and install
3.5-inch floppies and CDs.
Right.
Yeah, I like it. The cloud was beginning.
That's right. And so that was really my first taste of startup world. I didn't jump right into PR. I was actually more on the marketing analytics side, because they said, great, you have a finance background, you can work with data and, and finance, and we want to understand how our website is doing. We want to understand how the traffic is doing, what things are getting, good placement. And so we would literally every week go through this report where we would look at which software had done well. Was it based on where it was placed? Was it based on, it was the early days of kind of marketing analytics. And from there, I ended up working on the PR side. And then I was recruited to a company, which at the time was called LoudCloud, run by Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz. And they were the first to do cloud computing before it was called cloud computing. LoudCloud is still one of the best names for a company, I think. But we were a little bit early.
Got you. Yeah. Because the early days of cloud, those were rough. Those were rough years in the beginning.
Yeah, we didn't have.
It was a battle.
We didn't have virtualization. The cost, the economics model was not quite figured out yet. So that was tough. But one of the greatest things I did learn there was the art of storytelling from Mark. So Mark actually was, he was the chairman. He was not anyone's direct boss, except when our VP of marketing went on maternity leave for 3 months. And then he was tasked with managing a marketing team, which he had made it very clear, I never want to manage people, and I certainly don't want to manage this, but he was actually really good at it. And so one of my favorite stories is, he talked about, when we talked about things like product naming, and we talked about things like how do we, convey that sense of what something is. I vividly remember him asking a question like, do we buy cold dead fish? No, we don't buy cold dead fish, right? But we buy sushi. We buy and we voluntarily eat sushi all day long. So you have to, convey the story.
Which they're the same thing.
They are the exact same thing.
They're the exact same thing. But again, going back to the storytelling, if you're like, hey, do you want to go grab some cold dead fish?
That's right.
You'll be like, No, I don't. Actually, that
Yeah.
sounds terrible.
That sounds, no, I'll pass. Thank you so much. But you'll pay a premium for omakase, right? The
Yeah.
18 courses of cold dead fish.
You're right.
And so,
Do you want multiple
yeah,
trays of
yeah.
cold dead fish? Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
just
I
one piece
don't.
at a time. Yeah.
Yep.
And so, that really to me helped me understand, great. Okay, you can have the smartest engineers in the room, but you have to help them bridge that. And you have to do some storytelling to make sure that the people who are going to use and consume your products actually have a sense of what is behind it, what they want to do with it, and how it's going to make their lives better. Now, sushi is not a name that most people in the US knew. So that's not a perfect one-to-one example. But again, you're probably not going to call it the product description.
No, but what is interesting, well, the only place you ever do that I found is like on wish.com or Amazon. Like, I don't know if you've ever looked at some of the product descriptions where you're like, did you just slap every keyword that existed for this thing? And
Yes.
that's the product title.
Yeah.
But I think to your point with that, because the sushi one, and I see this a lot, especially in the tech world, where when there isn't a product category that has an established story, it can be a very uphill battle because there's a lot more storytelling that has to happen because there isn't this underlying oh yeah, people already know the plot and the characters and this other stuff. So you're actually kind of carving a new narrative versus a familiar one that you can kind of go, yes, this narrative is familiar, but here's our unique story type of a thing. So I see your point on the sushi. One question I have for you on the tech piece is, I'm curious your take on this storytelling piece from a technology standpoint. You clearly had experience in a lot of different areas, saw a lot of different things. Was the lack of storytelling something you saw worse or more of an opportunity area in the tech sphere than it was elsewhere? Or what did you see it as kind of like, man, we all probably could get better at this?
I think everyone can get better at storytelling, right? Because everyone can get better at being engaging and communicating with their audience. I think it is especially hard in software because some of the things that we do and enterprise software, you until you go take a look at it, you don't know what it does, right? You don't see it, it's not easy for everybody to communicate. You can't go hire the top 10 influencers and ask them to, hey, show me how you're using your product on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah.
You can't that there's not an easy way to connect your brand to a known brand already. You can do some of that with partner
Okay.
marketing, but especially with category creation. And I think the tech industry for a long time just sort of ceded that responsibility to folks like Gartner and Forrester, who said, I'm going to create a category and then everybody sort of fall under it. Today, people don't have that same sort of dependence on those firms. And so it is a bigger challenge because you're saying, well, maybe they haven't created a category yet. Maybe they never will. But also, maybe I don't want to be beholden to what they decide to create. Maybe I need to go and make that very clear on my own. And to do that, we used to have with one client, we used to have the equivalent of a swear jar where every time they said, this is what it does, they had to, put $1 into it instead of saying this is why it does it, right? Or every time they said well, the algorithm does this. And you're like, okay, well, this is not, Space Jam, and Algae Rhythm is not an interesting character in this book. We need to give people a better sense of, why do they care? How does it affect their day-to-day lives? And sometimes when you are brilliant and you've created a product and it should be so obvious that it affects your day-to-day life, you skip that part, right? As the engineer, you skip that part because you've lived it for so long.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So there's two angles, two directions, paths I want to go down a little bit. The first one is, let me see, which one do I want to go first? Let's take kind of the traditional way, especially software has evolved in this. Because to your point, I think for a lot of things, there was the historic, there were the couple big players and they defined the terms of the categories. And so everybody kind of fought over showing up on the grid in a different spot. And, that's what you did. I mean, and you went and you paid exorbitant amounts of money and you
That's
did
right.
all this stuff to land yourself in a certain quadrant of the 9 box so that everybody would go, oh, this is the best, blah, blah, blah. And even going back to that sushi example, we said there was kind of this underlying like, well, we maybe don't really know how this whole thing works and whatever, but we trust this kind of category that we relatively understand. So if the dot is on that box, we're probably okay with that. How has that evolved? Because I see in my industry specifically, it's a little slower than in other industries, but that has been disrupted in many regards.
Yeah, and I think, you see it in sort of traditional Web 2, and then you see it even more in Web 3, in that people are leaning on their communities and their fellow sort of trusted practitioners for that role. So, for example, I am a member of a group of female chief information security officers and other folks who are very senior in the cybersecurity space. The number
Okay.
of times that Slack group is active and talking about, hey guys, I'm thinking about either I have this challenge, how have you solved it? Or I'm thinking about deploying this kind of a solution. Has your experience been? They, on that side, as a customer, no longer also need to pay a Gartner or a Forrester for their advice, because they're getting the real world sort of crowdsourced information from their peers who have done it, who can say, this worked well, this didn't, this may work well in your environment because you have X, but not because you have Y. And then with Web3, it is all about these communities, right? Who are trying to figure out, Web3 is so nascent, right? It's like just having the base layer of the internet at this point. And so how do we also figure out what's the tooling, what's the other set of infrastructure that needs to be built? How do we partner with those other players so that we can make ourselves better and the whole ecosystem better? And then, how do we get that support from people who will share that, pretty unvarnished truth with us in terms of, this is what worked well, this is what didn't. Sometimes that leads to, hey, I'm going to call you out on how your architecture is built, but fine, that makes us all a little bit better.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so they don't have to have this sort of central authority. And I think, the ethos is, again, to your point about trust, is that we don't trust any single person or entity, but let's trust kind of the collective wisdom.
yeah. Well, and what's interesting about this is even societally, I think we see some of this happening where trust in the institution, whatever that institution was, has really been shattered. And in many ways, we were saying backstage, for good reasons. Like stuff comes out and people are like, wait a minute, like I used to just blindly like believe this and all this was going, like, I don't know that I can trust that anymore, type of a thing. And now in many ways it has been democratized, but it's kind of interesting to see whether, like you said, in some ways the institution is being reconstructed in a different manner, where it's like, well, now these communities, like you said, are in some ways becoming an institution, but in a very different way than the formal, like, well, just trust us because we're XYZ and we said so and so's on this plot grid. And people are like, yeah, that doesn't really work for me anymore. So, but we also aren't just going to say, well, Christopher said,
Right.
go buy this. Although sometimes people do. And I'm like, please don't do that. Please don't do that. But, it's one of those things where typically people won't just say, well, so-and-so said it. So we have to reimagine how some of that stuff comes together.
Yeah, they need to get validation, right, from a number of different sources. And I think, before, that used to be very time consuming and very painful. The internet has made it so that we can, do that more efficiently. Now, the tricky part is, you do also then have to be able to trust each of those individual sources, right? Or make your decision about, do I trust that Christopher is actually Christopher? And, how do I know what his intentions are? Because you don't always know that. So we're definitely in that learning curve in terms of, well, how do we trust the new people that we have sort of said we're going to
The
take
new
our
voices.
recommendations from?
Yeah. Well, because even with that, I mean, we see examples, and I'm not just talking tech industry, but you see examples of this where there's somebody who has maybe established credibility or trust, and then they go kind of rogue and start doing stuff. And all of a sudden people go, well, wait a minute. Like, I don't know that I can trust what you're doing. Because really, what are you even, is what you're telling me what you actually think and believe? Or is what you're telling me what you've been paid to say or do or whatever? And how much of that is the unvarnished truth versus how much of that is just the way the world works, where you're like, okay, I mean, yeah, it's messy right now. It's kind of an interesting space. But going back to okay, so now down path 2, this technical piece, the tech storytelling, I think in particular, like you said, can be challenging for 2 reasons. And I'm curious as you kind of unpack this a little bit. One being, you're dealing with people who may be hyper-focused and extremely familiar with what they're dealing with. And so there is this just natural assumption of like, well, of course this is great because I'm so familiar with the problem. Like, how do you not see that this is fixing that problem? But then I think another layer that adds to the complexity is, I don't know that society has kept up with the requirement of digital acumen that is often needed to even understand it. And so there's a lot of times assumptions, especially from technical people, like, oh, people just understand this stuff.
Yeah.
And my experience, especially as a learning leader, is most people actually don't. We're like, oh, they have iPhones, they understand technology. And you're like, no, they know how to go on their app, but they don't actually understand how it works. So how have you seen one overcoming that, and again, helping kind of bring that out in folks?
Yeah. And I think, there is sort of this goal that you've got to meet in the middle, right? In some ways, we are more abstracted from our technology than ever before, right? You can't take apart your, it's very hard to take apart your phone today and be able to play around with it and see what it is like you used to be able to do, right? If you were willing to tinker and do all those kinds of things.
Oh yeah. You used to be able to take a desktop computer apart and be like, oh, here's all, I mean, I took a class in how to put them together. I remember that. Now you're not doing iPhone repair in high school. I'm telling you that right now.
That's right. But on the other side, I think we as technologists have an obligation to make that story more relevant. So, and we also have an obligation to make that technology more accessible. So we have to say, great, if we know that 80% of the population will never care about how it works, we should stop talking about that, right? I'm talking to you over the internet today. I don't need to know anything about TCP/IP protocol. I don't need to know anything about all of those back-end things that work and just make our conversation today possible. What I do need to know is that my internet runs well. I will get high def, high speed video and audio, and that enables me to not have to get on a plane and fly to a studio, or you to get on a plane and fly to a studio, and have these conversations and have this kind of engagement. And so while we have to educate the people who are building things and the technologists who are going to buy them, to develop on them and to build on them, we also have to make it much, much simpler for the rest of the population, that 80% of the population, to engage with the technology and to be able to say, yep, I buy the premise of it and it's actually adding me value. Otherwise, technology just for technology's sake is a lovely toy, but it's not going to change our lives.
So on that one, one of the things that, and I cannot remember the simplicity quote and who said it, but there was, I can't remember if it's Einstein or something, who talked about like simplicity is the ultimate, like it's the ultimate challenge because we tend to just overcomplicate things. And in some ways, I get it. I deal with it on the technology side. I deal with it on the HR side a lot as well, where people are like, but this is so important. And you're like, it is for us to know this. The end user does not care about this. And sometimes people get really offended.
Yeah.
Let's just say I've offended people over the years where I've been like, nobody cares but you. And that doesn't mean it's not important. It's just nobody else cares and it's irrelevant to their level. How have you helped people in this storytelling process separate the wheat from the chaff in that? Because sometimes there are things that it's like, yes, this is critically important. And I'm not saying ignore it. I'm just saying in the storytelling part of it, maybe we don't need to include that detail in the story because your audience doesn't care.
Right. And I think also recognizing that perhaps there will be a percentage of the audience that cares. So let's find the right vehicle for that content, right? So maybe the initial announcement or the initial story has this very high level. But then if you are a developer or you are, kin to the people who are telling you that this is really important, there's a place for you to go find that if it's really important. But one of the analogies that I use a lot is, think of the kind of coming out of your story or the initial story that you're telling to the broadest set of people as a first date. If on that first date, you're like, look, I want to have 7 kids and
my wife would have left the table.
Right?
Or if she'd
Not
said that
the
to
time
me.
or the place. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you just, in that first date, in that first, you have 30 seconds to get somebody's attention and then to persuade them in. You really are just telling them enough to get them to the second date. And that second date might be, let me go explore your website. That might be, let me go listen to one of your videos. That might be, okay, great. I'm super technical. I want to go download your white paper. But you don't have to give them everything on the first date. And if you do give them everything on the first date, it will typically backfire.
Okay. A couple things that you brought up there that I just want to reemphasize that I love that you highlighted. And I think it's so true, just in my experience with this too, is there is this tendency of like the Franken presentation on the first date where it's like, oh, we got to make sure they know this and we got to make sure they know this. And like, by the time you're done, you look at this 200-page deck and you go, I don't think you've tried to say, who is anybody who's out there who might interact with this? And let's make sure we've given them everything. And as a result, you've cast the widest net, but you've actually resulted in catching nothing because you just literally threw it all over the place. And I think that's such an important piece but what you're saying, and I've seen this work well to help shut some of this stuff down, is you're not saying dump it. You're just saying, well, let's figure out where it belongs. Because I think of some of the best presentation. I know NVIDIA just did their big thing on AI and robots and things like that. And yeah, you had your people who were wowed by the 30 seconds, but then even in the comments and even myself, like I'm going, yeah, right. But what about, there's all these like specific details where you're like, yeah, but what AI models are you actually using? And it's like the general person's just like, I have no idea. And I don't even care to know that.
Right.
And so it's not saying we're not going to tell you that, because going back in the age of distrust, if you just say that's none of your business, or we don't think you need to know that, that's a great way to destroy your brand and your reputation. Right. It's about figuring out where is that audience and how do you get that information to them.
And then they feel smarter, right? They feel smarter because they have a question that your idea has sparked and they want to go find it. And they can sort of, solve that puzzle for themselves a little bit, right? By going deeper in one area. And so then they are actually engaged instead of just, on slide 25, sort of nodding off because you've given them so much.
Which I think anybody who watches or listens to this can relate to the meeting or presentation you've been in where that's happened. So on the other piece, and I really want to unpack and start digging into some of this trust stuff, but one of the other things that came up as we were thinking about this, and I think sometimes this can be the tendency to want to do the Franken presentation, is there can almost be this fear of, well, but what if a question comes up, or what if something happens that we haven't planned for, which I personally have. That's why I do live streams, because I'm like, I don't know, we'll deal with it. We'll roll with the punches.
The world will not end.
But a lot of people struggle with that because they're like, but I don't know how to handle. What if I get a question? I don't have all the details, or I don't have a slide that I can go to that lists all this out. How do you recommend, or what have you done to help people through that? Because while for me, I've always kind of just been like, oh, well, and what I know that can be a real barrier for some people.
And I think for a lot of people, they use slides as a crutch, right? So if I don't actually know my story, then it's much easier to kind of just read off the slides or have everything on a slide that I can refer to like a book. And you can't treat them that way. So, one of the greatest experiences I went through was when I did a TEDx talk. They make you prep for 9 months for 12 minutes.
Whoa. For a TEDx talk? Are you serious?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so you have to know your talk inside and out. So if anything happens, if your slides mess up, if, something goes wrong, no big deal. You can still deliver that. Now, I wasn't getting paid for that, but if I'm going into a client and I'm pitching a multi-million-dollar deal, you should spend at least as much time presenting for that talk. And therefore, you will know the content of those slides and you will have thought about what might people ask. If I've done my research on the customer and I've done my research on what they might care about, then I'm probably going to have some questions. And if I can verbally give those answers or verbally point them in the right direction, then why would I ever clog up a slide putting that on a slide? Because if I'm having to read off of a slide, I've lost the narrative and I've lost the engagement. If I'm having to have people read a slide while I'm talking, they can't do both, right? They can't listen to you and read at the same time.
You know, it's so funny you bring that up, because I really actually a lot of times try and discourage people from using slides, to your point, because they can become such a crutch. And I think sometimes while people think, oh, if I get this all right, it'll add to my credibility, my experience has actually been the opposite. If you're going back to your slides and trying to find the information or just kind of parroting what's on there, I actually feel like that actually degrades your credibility, because people really go, well, I just want to be able to, do you know this, or are you just going off of this? And it can actually have the opposite effect.
Yeah. One of the best presenters I've ever worked with is a gentleman named Gregory Toohill, who was Obama's cybersecurity czar, and is a general, now works in a number of research and think tanks. And as you can imagine, he is one of the most credible people on cybersecurity. Very complex topic. The first time we did a presentation, I was like, okay, you have 10 memes on 10 slides. And he knew exactly what he wanted to get across with each of those. He never had to pause. He never had to go and read off of a slide. He was using those slides to visually kind of give people a break and make them chuckle, and then say, great, this is really what I want to get home. And now they associate that image with whatever he was talking about. And so he was such a powerful and sought after speaker, and, not a single word on those slides except for the captions of those memes.
It can be terrifying. What's so funny is we're talking about digital storytelling, but everything we're talking about, the relevance and application, I think regardless of whether you're talking about technology or not, you could listen to what we're talking about and go, oh, I could actually benefit from that. Because I even think of what you just described right there. I've actually found generative AI, this can actually be a really powerful practice for generative AI image generation, where for me, I don't like slides. In fact, I find they are very distracting. But some places are like, well, you have to have slides, which drives me bonkers. But that's where the generative AI has been really helpful, because I can then say, this is what's in my head visually that I think is my jumping off point. But to your point, I don't want to distract the audience where they're so busy reading the bullets and doing this other stuff. But I do want to maybe visually capture their attention and go, here's what we're getting across. But that requires, to your point, to your TEDx preparation, you can't just be like, well, I don't know what I'm going to say. And I do think, to your point, a presentation can often become a crutch.
Yeah. And some of the best speakers go through presentation training regularly, and they rehearse regularly, right? Larry Ellison had a speech writer and speech coach who, would practice with him. And most executives hate to do it. And then after they've done it and, they're so sick of their presentation that they can do it no matter what happens on stage, they are always grateful that they have done it, because something inevitably goes wrong, right? A light shines in your eye, or, people cough or say something at inappropriate times, or you trip on something. And when you have that when you know that story to your core, that stuff doesn't faze you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's just it, especially in today's day and age, with as many tools and technologies and something that are usually running as this stuff is going, something will break. I mean,
for sure,
something's going to blow up. Your presentation's going to turn off, or your clicker's going to quit working, or, like you said, the lights will be in your eyes, or your webcam's going to cut out, mid stage, something like that. So we've added so many more tools to the tech stack that inevitably something will blow up.
Yeah.
Now I want to shift to the trust piece, because this is a rising area of concern that I think a lot of people have, where it's like, in an age where you can clone somebody's voice, clone their image, and then make a digital version of pretty much whatever you want. You can go ask ChatGPT to go make a video of this and it'll do it. Not on the public beta yet, but we're getting to that point.
Yeah.
What are some things, as you think about storytelling, that can help address this underlying trust barrier that we're often dealing with everything, where people go, even if I like what you're saying, how can I really trust that it's you, or that what you're saying is accurate?
Yeah. So I think there are some really interesting things going on in terms of provenance of data and provenance, and that includes provenance of images and video, et cetera. So Reuters has done some really interesting work with Canon and a group called Project Starling, where they actually, and this will come back to blockchain and Web3, where they actually embed in the devices the ability to record. When you are taking a photo, I can give you the geolocation, the time, all of the metadata around where, when, how that photo was taken, and I can write that to a public ledger. So I can prove that this picture was taken in Ukraine after a Russian bombing, and it was of the school that I tell you it's about. Now, this has, broader implications than just storytelling, right? This is when they go to the UN tribunal in 30 years and need to prove that this is not a fake image, and that this was truly generated at this place and this time, and these are all the right people, et cetera, et cetera. You are going to see, I think, people say, I need to prove the provenance of whatever I am seeing in front of me. So that might apply to those kinds of images. It may also apply to, things like we're seeing with the whole Hollywood and writer strike, right? So if my voice is being used for movies or for voiceovers, perhaps I can digitally sign, I have a way to digitally sign, this is my voice, and this is, proof that the company paid for my voice, and then I get royalties based on, how that voice was used. Same thing, you can see artists saying, great, I can put on the blockchain all of the art that is truly my art and comes from my source, and people can verify that because it's, it's been written out there publicly. Anybody can go to any of these, sources on the blockchain and verify it. So I do think there is going to be a lot more focus on AI provenance, the lineage of some of these AI models. Hey, is it really training it on data that it was allowed to train it on? Is that data biased? Is it not biased? Did it only use data sets for, that it was allowed to have access to? There are all of these kinds of really important issues that will be probably in the back end, but that will help the consumer say, yep, this is verified, and I can demonstrate that this is actually, this is the real Beyonce, and she's really singing her song, and she's really given permission for this.
Yeah. Well, and it's so funny with that. I have somebody coming on the show who specializes in cybersecurity around this. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is the fact that even, the digital fingerprint of your voice anymore, like the technology's getting there to the point where, we can start to say, wait a minute, this was digitally crafted narrative. Like this wasn't even, it sounds exactly like Christopher, but we can detect in here that this is it's an AI generated thing. And right now it feels like we're on more of a honor system.
Yeah. Well, and we're not.
That's where we are right now, where it's like,
yeah, there are people taking advantage of that and, calling grandmothers and grandfathers and pretending to be the grandkids and, saying, hey, I really need you to give me money. Like those are all ways that people are using the
Exploiting
technology.
it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, because even on YouTube just added, and I saw it in the Creator Studio this week, they've now added a thing where you have to flag, if you're using AI generated video content as part of the content that you're creating. But what's interesting about it is we're still very much in this honor system phase, because at
Right.
the bottom it's like hidden in the settings and you have to be like, am I aware of it or no? And
Yeah.
it's one of those like, well, I mean, what anybody could be like, no, I have no idea what you're
Right.
talking about.
It would be much
Type
better
thing.
if you can prove it, right?
Right, right. And I think of the implications of how we're going to have to move through that. But I think going back to the trust piece, I am curious where this lands and some of the things we were talking about of that not having all the answers. And I'm curious your take on this, because I do think sometimes people have this perception that if you don't have all the answers, people won't trust you. And so there can be this tendency to go, well, if I'm going to give a presentation or I'm going to tell a story, I have to know every single detail, because if it comes up and I don't know the answer, I will lose trust. What's been your observation, or how do you kind of help people with that? Because inevitably, I mean, I've done enough public stuff. There's going to be a curveball that comes your way times where you go,
Yeah.
I have not even considered that, type of a thing.
Yep. And I think you have to own it, right? I think the more that you own it and the faster that you own it, people do understand that. They are going to ask you questions that you don't always know the answer to or that you have not experienced. And so it is a trust building exercise to admit that and to say, I don't know. Either here are some people who might know, and I'm going to point you in their direction, or I think we don't know that as an industry. I think the worst thing to do is to try to pretend, and then you have the then you have the problem of,
then you've got the Reddit threaders like
yeah.
all over you being like, hey, wait, yeah.
I think people underestimate though the power of humility, right? They see, for example, Taylor Swift, and you study Taylor Swift and you go, wow, she is an amazing success. She is great at harnessing that power of humility. She is great at putting herself out there in terms of saying, I don't know everything about relationships, and I'm going to let you watch me, flail at some of them in the public eye, right? She's also great at very sort of tongue in cheek on her songs, talking about how, she messed things up, or in her interviews talking about, some of her biggest flub moments. And people love her. So I think understanding that people don't want to see a robot. They don't want to see something that is perfect, because in some ways that inspires more sort of feelings of jealousy or hostility. Show them that human side. It's okay. They will actually appreciate you and trust you more for doing that.
It's so funny, and that's why I wanted to see where you would go with it. But it's so funny that you bring this up, because that's been my experience as well, that this idea, and even with parenting, I mean, I think about being a dad to 7 kids.
Most
This
humbling
idea that being well, but I mean, even with my kids, there is this like traditional wisdom that says you can never let your kids know that you don't know, or you make mistakes, or you flubbed. And honestly, even in my own home with my kids, some of the most trust building moments have been when I've been like, I screwed that up. Like, I made a really big mistake and daddy shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry. Like, I don't know what else to say. I'm not going to excuse it. I just made a mistake. And you would think that would lead to people. And I've seen the same thing in being a people leader, where you think, oh, I'm the manager now. I got to have all the answers and I better do all this. And when you actually come to your teams and go, I don't know. I haven't thought of that. What do you think? Like, what are your thoughts on that? It can actually be, to your point, a counterintuitive lesson in building trust versus breaking trust. And I feel like in the AI age, I feel like that's come out more from people, where there was the era, and I'm curious kind of the trajectory you've seen, but it seems like it used to be talking head, perfectly polished, scripted everything, like you couldn't miss a beat. And that's kind of what people expected. They kind of expected, like, I don't want to see anything. And with AI creating more of this almost artificial veneer of perfection, it almost seems like societally we kind of gravitate more towards I like when I see the flaws and the humanity of people, because it lets me know they're real, instead of like, well, I saw this perfectly polished press conference where nothing went wrong and the lighting was perfect and their hands never moved. Is that even like a real person on the other side, or is this just an AI generated version of it? It almost seems like it's brought it out.
Yeah, well, and I do think I think it's that, but also, the effect of, we forget that COVID was not that long ago, right? And we were all at home, and we sort of all had to share more of our personal lives. So I don't know if you remember the BBC commentator who was super buttoned
I
up.
loved it.
Probably never listened to him, and I've watched that clip of his toddler, coming in, and his second kid and his poor wife. I mean, I've probably watched that one 20 times.
Oh, it's hilarious. It's like the most humanizing thing, because we can all relate to it. And the fact that they're trying to pretend it's not happening is just the best part, because you're like, there's literally a circus going on behind you. Like, just turn around for a good second and go, give me 1 second.
Yeah.
And then move on. Just don't pretend it's not happening.
Yeah. So I think that also allowed us to say, hey, we're humans, right? We have families, we have dogs, we have all these things that are part of our life. So, let us try to embrace that. And, we do want trusted experts, but we also want to make sure that they are real. We want to make sure that they are not, sort of the Elizabeth Holmes and everything was perfect, and that ended up being a facade. We've seen that a lot of times. So I think you can't artificially create that persona, but I think by being very genuine in terms of what you don't know, and what what is not your areas of capability, and also what humanizes you, people are gravitating more towards.
Okay, so flipping the script on this one a little bit, I'm curious, for folks who may watch and listen, maybe you're not the storyteller, because I think we've talked a lot about the power of storytelling, some of the ways to do that in really meaningful ways. But then if you're the story consumer, do you have any recommendations or just kind of advice on that? Because we talked about it backstage, and even in this, that I completely empathize and understand why people do struggle with it. And there is plenty of data that shows people will buy stories over data, which can be really good. And it can also be really dangerous, because you can, again, use it to manipulate people. And have you seen things as obviously you're the architect of a lot of this stuff, but are there any pieces of advice or feedback that you would give to people who may be on the consumption side of storytelling that help you, one, pick out some of these indicators of like, hey, when is this a story that maybe you want to slow down and maybe do a little digging into before you just dive headfirst into?
Yeah. I think that is, it's interesting, because I think my kids are also going through and being taught, sort of in school, hey, how do we trust sources on the internet, right? How do we think about how to trust sources on the internet? And one of the great stories
that's happening in school. You say
middle school.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic that we're educating people in that at an early age. But in some ways, it's crazy to think that we're like,
they have to, right? They're consuming anything and
to.
everything that pops up in front of them. But there's a great story about the northwestern tree octopus. And, you go to the website and it looks like a real website, and it's, please help us, I don't know, save the northwestern tree octopus. And somebody has spent a lot of time to create this site and make it look like it's really real. And, you sort of ask the kids, okay, well, it's on the internet, so it must be real, right? And they're like, well, I don't know, maybe it's real. Like, and you go, well, wait a minute. So what else do I know, right? What are my other sources that I can use to try to triangulate, can octopi live in trees? There's a lot of good kind of basic, common sense things that they're saying, okay, maybe I should verify this elsewhere, right? Maybe I should think about all the things that almost essentially you would learn in traditional writing or traditional journalism school, right? I need to verify this with 3 to 5 sources. You're not going to do that for things that don't really matter, right? You read something on the internet, you you do or don't really care about it, great. That was fun. That was an entertaining article, move on. But for things that you really care about, things that are going to affect your health, things that are going to affect your finances, your jobs, your family, all those kinds of things, can you have those 3 to 5 different sources? My little one came home and said, Mommy, one of my classmates told me that the flu shot gives you the flu. And I said, okay, well, rather than just sort of brushing him off, I said, okay, well, how many times have you had the flu shot, buddy? And he's like, I don't know, 6. And I said, okay, well, how many times have you had the flu? He's like, never. I'm like, okay, so your friend, said this to you. Now,
Yeah.
taking a step back, do you think that's true?
Yeah.
And then he told me, the 4 other things that his friend said that I was like, okay, well, we're not going to do the same kind of rigorous analysis on that.
But again, going back to the character piece, even that lesson in that starts to help you go, okay, if, again, said individual says this and you start going, well, wait a minute, you just lied to me about that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, now these other 6 things that you just said, how much, which I think goes back to the importance of, if you're the storyteller, to your point of don't fudge it if you don't know.
Right.
Because you can destroy your credibility and go, well, if you didn't know that and you pretended like you did, what else do you not know that you also communicated as though you did?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, and I think something that's relevant to that I don't know that I have the answer to this. So if you do, I am curious to hear it. But
probably not.
there is just, and I don't know if it's just in the air right now in society or what, but it does feel like in conversations I have, people acknowledge there's just almost a tension or urgency in the air that just is pushing people. And one of the things I talk a lot about is like, slow down. There's just a need for us at this age, and AI seems to just be pushing harder to be like, we got to go faster. We got to do things quicker and more efficiently and all this other stuff. And sometimes, again, being on making sure you're not getting hijacked by a story is to actually take the time to slow down. And even that question with your kid, well, let's think about this for 1 minute. And half the time, we don't even take the time to do that. We're so busy running off on the conclusions that we've drawn from the things we've heard, instead of going, well, hang on, I haven't even taken the time to process what I just heard and what I'm thinking, and I'm already off reacting to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, it's almost some of the same lessons from cybersecurity in terms of things like phishing, right? So a lot of times, if you don't click on that email right away, if you wait a day or two, that entire phishing infrastructure sometimes will be taken down, right? And won't be an issue because you won't, they won't be able to attack you the way they could have. But I do think, getting outside, being with community, having a sanity check of the people around you. If you, thinking about telling that story to your 5 closest friends, and would they be like, oh, wow, that's really compelling? Or would they be like, what has happened to you? Like, what? Why do you believe this to be true? I think is a good, so even just thinking about how do we go back to some of those things? How do we go back to community? How do we go back to, the kind of storytelling that used to happen a long time ago? We're not certainly sitting around the fire, but, when you have to tell someone that live and in person, does that sort of pass the sniff test?
Well, and to the point of community, that I think is something that is missed a lot is, we don't engage with and have healthy discourse with stories we don't like. And I feel like the internet age has only fueled that further, where it's like, if I don't like something, I just don't even have to engage with it. And I can surround myself with the things that just kind of confirm what I already think, or, it's the echo chamber of things. And I know for me personally, even sometimes when it's painful to be like, I'm going to listen to this point of view or this story from another side that I actually don't even want to hear.
Yeah.
But I want to try and listen to it to hear. I want to break it down for legitimate, like, am I really breaking it down because there's legitimate concerns or things that I'm seeing in it that don't stand up to your examples of like, this just doesn't hold up to good standards of journalism. instead of just, I don't like it because it's making me mad. And so
Right.
therefore I'm discrediting everything they're saying. And what I found is if I can actually get my amygdala hijacked to shut up for a minute, a lot of times there is some truth and wisdom in what they're saying. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess I can understand that. Or if you're looking at it this way, I can at least understand where you're coming from, type of a thing. I may not agree the pathway that we're getting to, but again, that requires you to slow down instead of just be hijacked by your emotions.
Yeah. And I think it requires you to also understand, okay, can I go to sources that won't fire me up because there's not a lot of hyperbole, right? Can I go to
Right.
sources that are reporting it and giving me, it may not be something I like to hear, but it is mostly fact based versus, I think we now on Twitter and on broadcast TV have sort of elevated a lot of these personalities who all they're there to do is really designed to make people
Make you
mad.
mad.
Yeah. And so why should
Well,
they be a source of information if they make money by making people mad? So I don't want to feed that beast. I don't want to grow their audience. If there are different points of view and they can be delivered in a more fact-based way, then I think it is easier to say, okay, I can understand that perspective and I can perhaps believe certain parts of this argument because I don't have this like screaming person at me, to start the argument.
yeah. Well, and the piece that I think people can walk away from, whether you're a storyteller or a story consumer on this, that I think is so true in what you just said right there is, if you're a storyteller, there is so much temptation and pressure to, and I think on the tech side, to only tell how amazing the product is, say everything that's wonderful about it, like exaggerate the heck out of like this idealistic state and not acknowledge the greater complexity for it. Or if you're telling a story in general, to exaggerate and use this hyperbole, because again, it grabs people's attention and the data is clear. People engage with stuff.
Yeah.
I can say from just personal experience, there is a lot of pressure to do the hyperbole and get people amped up and get them angry and do that because that's the stuff that gets the clicks, it gets
Yep.
the shares, it gets the reads. But when you're the one who's actually going, let's talk about the complexity of this. And here's really what's going on. And here's this side, here's how this fits together. And I'm not here to just tell you it's all perfect. And if you go this way, your life will be great. But I think there's enough merit to this that's going to do that. That can be extremely hard. And it's hard on a consumer end because you want to just read the thing that makes you mad or confirms your point of view. And it actually takes work to go, no, I'm actually going to go to the source that isn't quite as gets me all emotionally hijacked. But it's hard too, if you're the storyteller, to not go, yeah, but wouldn't this story go so much further if I made my headline like AI is the end of the world? Like, wouldn't this podcast just take off if I did, instead of going, yeah, but full well that's not really what's going on,
Yes.
type of a thing. And I think that's a really important message for both sides to consider as we move forward.
And it is a challenge, in an area where everybody believes they are a marketer, right? Everybody believes they can do marketing better. Everybody says, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? At the end of the day, you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I did that with integrity and I did that based on the facts. And yes, people can spin wild tales, but, I think I am old enough to have seen that comes back to bite you.
I was just going to say, it's my experience and having seen this is it's short-term gains sometimes for long-term pain.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, maybe you can buy the hype cycle and maybe it might get you some dollars and some attention in the short term. But when you fall, you're going to fall hard and it's going to hurt really bad. And I think about that even just from a tech company standpoint, that I've seen companies that have made these just exorbitant promises and you're like,
yeah,
this is not going to go well when people find out, and Elizabeth Holmes, you brought up that example. It was a perfect example of that. Oh, we can solve everything from a drop of blood.
Right.
If it sounds too good to be true, it probably, it's a great storyline. Sounds wonderful. You can create a whole facade.
Yeah.
But then when it implodes, oof.
Yep.
It is that much further you fell. Well, Zenobia, this has been extremely fun. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope
Me
you have as
too. Thank
well.
you so much.
And for everybody watching and listening, hopefully this, we didn't go into the hype cycle, because really the thing with storytelling is it's complicated, but I hope that everybody can see that there are ways that you can do this well regardless. But I think especially in this digital age, it's exceptionally important. But also, if you're a consumer of stories, some ways to watch out, because stories also have the power to manipulate. And I get very concerned when people get hijacked by this stuff and they go down these crazy paths. So thank you for the work you're doing and helping with this, and then just for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. If you are not subscribed to the Substack and maybe you didn't catch the whole thing, check it out, and you'll get that later this week with some of my biggest insights and reflections on the conversation. And with that, we will see you next week.